Hello, everyone. Welcome to this seminar. As this is, as you know, part of the public lectures of theory, methodology, and practice of decolonization, organized by the Social Sciences Institute of Rhode University. I know many others have been involved, so thank you everyone for organizing this. Today's theme is Abolition as Decolonization of Peoples, Movements, and Knowledge. I am Ozlem. I'll introduce our session and I'll introduce our roundtable participants of the day. And then we will have some questions to have an open dialogue on this theme of abolition, criminalization of movements, and its relevance to discussions of decolonization. So today we will discuss decolonization, and decolonization of academia and more broadly knowledge cannot be separated from ongoing colonization of peoples and criminalization of movements and movement intellectuals. In this seminar, we will discuss abolition as a revolutionary theory and political action with an attention to ongoing criminalization of revolutionary movements and revolutionary thought and the work of imprisoned intellectuals. And this is a very timely topic as criminalization of, for example, the context that I am familiar with and where Rhode University is situated, criminalization of Kurdish resistance against the colonial states and capitalism and patriarchy in its different forms has been heightened by Turkey, by Syria, by Iraq. Kurds have been under attack of massacres and genocides, but simultaneously criminalization, imprisonment of movements, of movement intellectuals is an ongoing process. It's contemporary, it's happening as we speak. So we will address with this theme of abolition, we will address broader issues such as criminalization and imprisonment as an ongoing process of colonization. How is that states use imprisonment, use criminalization as an ongoing process of colonization? And we will also look at the work of abolition as an anti-colonial act. And we'll discuss more specific issues such as whether there is space for revolutionary thought in a university setting. As we know, some of these concepts become popularized and used in academia, in university settings, and people even make careers out of these concepts. At times there's some space, but what does that space mean? Is it a real space? Does it really allow us to bring revolution into the university or to produce and how does it look like? What would then be the relationship between a movement and academia, between the movements and revolutionary movements and academia? So there are many questions on the table, and we'll also discuss question of how to translate abolition politics into the making and disseminating of knowledge. So is another knowledge possible? Is evolutionary knowledge possible? How can we produce it? How can we disseminate it? And who are we? Are we academics? Are we movement intellectuals? What is the difference? So there are many, many questions on the table. And without further ado, I will introduce our participants formally, but then we'll have a chance to actually get to know them a little bit better. And I feel like this is an important, timely thing to do for the theme of decolonization, to get to know movement intellectuals from different contexts and to put each other in relation with via in a roundtable format. So I feel like even formatting of things have an impact on how we produce knowledge, how we disseminate that knowledge. So very much looking forward to this discussion between Joy James, Zoe Samudzi, and Berivan, Kutlay, Sarikaya. So I'll introduce them briefly. Joy James is the F.C. Oakley Professor of Humanities at Williams College, where she teaches in political science, Africana studies, women and gender studies, and American studies. She's the author of many books, including Shadowboxing, Representations of Black Feminist Politics, and Resisting State Violence, Radicalism, Gender, and Race in the US Culture. Her edited books include Warfare in the American Homeland, Policing and Prison in a Penal Democracy, Imprisoned Intellectuals, The New Abolitionists, New Slave Narratives and Contemporary Prison Writings, and Warfare in the American Homeland. Her current research, critical of mainstream discussions of abolition, focuses on the algorithm of anti-racism and rebellion against the racial, carceral, imperial state violence by the captive maternals. Zoe Samudzi is a writer and art critic whose work has appeared in Art in America, The New Inquiry, The Architectural Review, The New Republic, Art Forum, and other outlets. She's an associate editor with Parapraxis magazine. Her co-authored book, As Black as Resistance, makes the case for a new program of self-defense and transformative politics for Black Americans. And finally, Berivan Kutlay Sarikaya is a Kurdish anti-abolition feminist scholar activist. She received her PhD from the Adult Education and Community Development Program at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, and is currently working as gender-based violence project coordinator at OCASI, Toronto, Canada. She researches, and her work has appeared in many journals and edited book volumes. And she researches questions of gendered colonial violence, incarceration, criminalization of Kurdish women, and as well as politics of silencing and the resistance of Kurdish women to these different forms of silencing. We shared in the chat more on their bios, so you can learn more about them. And we have a lot on the table, so I want to just open the discussion and maybe we'll go in order as I introduce them in responses to these questions. So the first question that we should discuss is, what brought each of you to the work of abolition, and why is it important for you as people, right? Why is it important for you? So Joy, if you, would you like to get us started?
Sure, I always like to go last because I learn better if I can listen first, but I'll jump in. So let's see here. Right, so decades ago, I organized with different radical formations when it was more clear that, you know, there was a distinction between anti-capitalism and imperialism. I think now the lines are a bit blurry because we have celebrity leadership. And so sometimes wealth becomes a signifier of success. But back in the day, decades ago, like nobody I knew had any money or real money as far as I knew. And so I organized in the States, I organized a bit outside of the States. But because I organized with communist women, that's how I was introduced to Davis. So I did meet Davis in the academy. So I have a strong critique of the academy as a politicizing site because I wasn't politicized by it. I was just, that was my day job. You know, I made my money by having a doctoral stipend, and that's how I paid rent. I wasn't enamored with it as a zone of intellectualism. But because I organized with people in New York City, they introduced me to Davis, did a little organizing with them. I had a postdoc and went to California. That's how the Angela White Davis reader came about. And that's how I was introduced to abolitionism, having a postdoc at UC Santa Cruz. I was a bit outside the box because even my critiques of what were possibilities tended to be disaffected from some of the luminaries. So I had an early critique of Foucault because it didn't align with the Black radical women, especially the ones who had links to Africa and the Caribbean, right? So they weren't US focused. And a lot in the US, like for whatever reasons, the way we're trained is to sort of bow down to European theory. Without looking at indigenous cultures and working class intellectualism. So Davis, I've said this before, asked me to do a prototype of Crit Resist. I did, and then that became a split. because I realized that the people I invited who were not on the official list, they were Black Panthers. And that's because I organized not only with communists, but I also knew some of the Panthers. And that led to the anthologies that you read off, which were all about political prisoners. So, I don't want to take up too much time, so I'd stop here. For me, the key dichotomy was when I realized that the people who engaged in the struggle, the people who followed their hearts into rebellion, the people got shot up and caged, and obviously some of them got buried. They manifested a kind of political will and analysis that was not compatible with the academy and would not be compatible with any attempt to assimilate into liberal progressivism. And those became the folks that I anthologized because they made sense. Even though I am not a revolutionary, I understood that what they were positioning and bringing to us was an experiential, existential, whatever you want to call it, but the material reality of political struggle that could not be reduced to a commodity. I think though now, decades later, everything has been turned into a commodity, including Black revolt.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Joey. Zoe, jump in.
Yeah, I think that my path to abolition is obviously much less storied, but I think my kind of early thoughts about decolonization, anti-colonial politics kind of came out of an uncle of mine who was a veteran of the liberation struggle against the Rhodesian government. And so he, introduced me to Fanon and introduced me to all of the ways that these internationalist, Afro-diasporic texts were directly applied to their own sense of psychological and material revolution and or liberation and freedom. And that kind of direct application was really, really affecting for me in thinking about how, and I think that I'm really keen to talk more to limitation of academic thought, but then also what is opened up by the different ways that these ideas do get materialized and do get applied. And then being in the Bay, I think, was really impactful, and doing my PhD around basically the stomping grounds of the Black Panthers in Oakland. And then I think I really began to deepen my understanding of abolition politics in doing my dissertation about German colonization and the Ovaherero and Nama genocide. And I think a big part of my approach is, I was doing a PhD in medical sociology, was really thinking about the ways that biomedical logics really structure how we understand citizenship, how we understand nation building, and how we understand belonging, how that then gets translated into all of these different legal codifications. With the creation, for example, of the crime of genocide, it really defines and enforces who can and who cannot be killed. But obviously we know that it's an incredibly, the actual kind of deployment and application of the term is incredibly inconsistent. And so even in this alleged protection of groups of people who are particularly vulnerable, there is still this kind of political motivation behind who is allowed to be killed and who needs to be killed, and then who can be a victim, and then the kind of, juridical political episteme that has been built around that after World War II. And I think that in trying to really apply that theory to practice, my understanding has been, deepened even further in following the affected communities, the Ovaherero, the Nama, as well as the San, in the ways that they are articulating an understanding of justice and an understanding of reparations, not just as this financial compensation that is mediated by the state, which necessarily perverts any understanding of justice and sovereignty, because the nation state is not a vehicle for indigenous sovereignty. and really specifically thinking about the land and the implications and the necessity to center land in the conversations that we're having about abolition around the world, in really constantly reminding me, like, Eve Tuck wrote that decolonization, cannot be a metaphor. So I'm really keen to talk more about this.
Thank you, Zoe. Berivan, jump in.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Joy. I am always so fascinating to listen to you. My abolition work and also interest goes back to very early years of also, I think, my college years, and also born in a very pro-Kurdish family, witnessing all in my life, all my relative criminalization, and eventually also my colleagues when I was working in a Kurdish news in 1993. And at that time, I was always thinking that I didn't have any courage to join the movement, but my duty always be in the solidarity network of the movement. And that also makes me to work in this area as a journalist and then as a human rights activist. But all my work was around the state courts and following the trial and cases of the Kurdish students and Kurdish activists, later Kurdish politicians, and also as a human rights researcher, documenting all these prisons and the human rights violations and their dire conditions to the, for example, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. Then I just realized that all my activism, all my college years, all my personal experiences also shaped my scholarship. Dissertation, my PhD, the first question always was like, why you are just working on prison? It's very rare, it's understudied. It's not only understudied area, it's not only scholarly curiosity that I was doing my research, it's all just coming from my, the background, working on criminalization and incarceration of the Kurdish people, especially women, because I also realized that the stories and also the resistance history always written by male activists, prisoners. Then I realized, okay, where are the Kurdish women that I have been also in the circles, all my activism, also coming back to my scholarship. Then I started to pursue my research. But what I realized that the incarceration and captivity is part and parcel of Turkish state, Kurdish colonial state, but also Kurdish history as well. Then I went back to the 40 years ago, the military junta period, and in a notorious prison, there is still the Kurdish resistance. It's written there. But I just realized that where are, again, these Kurdish women political prisoners, and I went back to I think, I would say, those women who live in exile. And I did my research and I finished it and I did all interviews, but still the colonial violence was and is continuing in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria. And right now also I'm pursuing another project aside of my PhD, collecting the Kurdish women's stories from these 4 parts of Kurdistan, 4 parts of colonial prisons, because I would like to also show that the colonialism, the colonial violence can also differentiate it in terms of genocide, in terms of captivity, in terms of, for example, the Yazidi women in Syria. But my concern right now is showing their resistance, showing their silent resistance to the world, and also showing their abolition struggle still is going on in these colonial prisons. And even we were calling only, the Saddam prisons and Assad prisons from Syria as if they all dismantled. Unfortunately, it's not. Kurds are still living in open air prisons. And this is the work of abolition work. I think I will say that my activism and my scholarship, right now I'm trying to just make a narrow these two sides, activism and academia, towards working on prison abolition. This is, I think, I'm trying to do right now as pursuing PhD and then collecting all these Kurdish women's stories.
Thank you so much, everyone. So one of the reasons that we are bringing these different contexts together is to build bridges of solidarity. But at the same time, there's so much to learn from each other. And there's so much to learn from the different methods that imperial colonial racial states use. But at the same time, the parallels that there are in all these cases. And we are yet to learn from each of these contexts. So for those who are not familiar, right, somebody listening here will be more familiar with Kurdish history versus US versus, the context in the decolonizing Africa that Zoe was studying. So I want each of you to please, can you tell more about, and as if, we don't know nothing about it, the criminalization of the oppressed and revolutionary movements in your context, historically and contemporary? For example, Joy and Zoe both mentioned Black Panthers movement, but there might be many in the audience who are not familiar with this movement and also, more, and the evolution of these movements. So let's start. Is there anyone who wants to get us started, or should I do Joy, Zoe, and Berivan again?
Why not Zoe?
Yes, let's start with Zoe.
So I think the context that I kind of do my work in, it's less about the specific incarceration and more so about the deliberate exclusion of communities from any kind of negotiation or any kind of articulation of what justice looks like. So in the Namibian context, the German genocide of the Ovaherero and Nama officially was between 1904 and 1908. Germany lost its colony after World War I. And then German Southwest Africa became part of apartheid, or first it was kind of British South Africa, then became administered as a part of apartheid South Africa. And then there was independence in 1990. And so the criminalizations that we see as far as movements, of course, we see all of this apartheid era criminalization of basically any kind of state critical notion of indigenous sovereignty, of Black majority rule, under the kind of aegis of anti-communist containment, and also, of course, these different empires attempting to maintain their colonial holdings. And so we see in Southern Africa the border war. But I think what is most kind of interesting and relevant, I think, to this conversation is the kind of epistemicide that is taking place, and the kind of refusal to recognize the real actual implications of what the Ovaherero and Nama communities are actually understanding as a sense of kind of post-genocide justice, right? There, of course, we understand reparations as this kind of, I really love this idea of ethnomathematics that Diane Nelson writes about really fascinatingly in the context of the Guatemalan genocide in Guatemala, but it's this idea of attempting to kind of quantify life, right, which we know is this incredibly colonial, incredibly Eurocentric understanding of personhood. But instead, they're saying that we are dispossessed of our land. The dispossession of our land originated in the German imperial context, was continued under the apartheid context, and is continuing under this post-colonial African, independent African state. And so there's a really critical drive. And I think that I've learned a lot from the kind of Kurdish struggles in this, of recognizing the ways that nation states capture capture land, the ways that the kind of continued bordered existence of the nation state precludes indigenous sovereignty. And so what they're saying is that there needs to be land reform, right? There has never really been really deep, large-scale land reform in Southern Africa after the ending of these settler states. And so when we look at the holdings of farms, so much of this agricultural land is still held by the descendants of these German settlers, as well as Afrikaners and other kind of different white groups or white peoples. And so what they're understanding as a reparation is sovereignty, not just this kind of recognition by the state, because the denial of their sovereignty, they understand that as delegitimizing the nation state, that they understand exists solely to perpetuate the interests of SWAPO, the kind of capture of the revolutionary imagination, all at the expense of these indigenous communities whose cattle were all killed, their land was taken. And so I think that there's a really, rather than the kind of large scale incarceration that both Joy and Berivan were talking about, there's this real state erasure, this destruction of memory, this destruction of testimony, this refusal to kind of recognize the legitimacy of experience in order to maintain the kind of hold of the state. Because as we know, indigenous sovereignty and the state, like it's zero sum as far as as far as this existence. I don't know. I want to yield to the other two because I know that they have much more kind of relevant things to say here.
Joy, would you like to?
Okay. So to build on that, and also what Berivan was saying, I'm thinking about the connectors, right? So maybe to start a little history. So, right, most of us don't know what happened. Forgive me if I mispronounce anything of the Herero, right? In terms of, we think of Europe and the Nazis. We don't think of like how they practice before the 1930s and 1940s, right? So there's a way, and this was my critique of Foucault, right? There's a way in which the slaughter of Europeans captures the attention of whites around the globe, or European descent, right? But the mass slaughter, which is how you get colonialism and accumulation and extraction, right? Whether it's in Kenya, right? Whether it's in Australia, we could go around the globe, right? That becomes mystified because the lack of standing and recognition of what constitutes the human as being from Africa or the Middle East or Asia. They just don't register as fully human. So the deaths and the tracking of those deaths and the recognition. So what Zoe was saying about memory, I think in some ways memory is an extension of politics. That if you really want to control the order, then you tamper with the capacity of communities to remember the atrocities, not just about themselves as victims, but also their resistance. So resistant movements are always mystified because if people remember, they're like, oh, we tried this one. Why don't we like re-engineer it, try it this way and see, launch it one more time. So the point is pacification, I would argue. And this is why the academy is problematic, because I'm not always sure that we're teaching the restoration of memory of what is painful, but also what is politically charged in terms of resisting state violence. So back to the Panthers, right? So the Panthers started in 1966 and their formal title was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, because they understood the violence of the state administered through police forces. So they're the external forces that the US does because it's an empire. And it's like, we're going to help invade, colonize, false claims of weapons of mass destruction. That was more recent. They keep switching sides, betraying people that they kind of lure in to support the democracy effort. Sorry, I mangled that one. But in 1966, right, the Panthers understood a trajectory from the civil rights movement. And that movement itself, like we can think of the icons, Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in 1955, right, as a sign of rebellion, but that follows the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till and his open casket funeral. And so I've said this before, what sparks our movement sometimes is you just murder enough of our children, then people are like, yeah, we're not doing business as usual. We're going to resist. We're going to do work stoppages. Or, you know, in Birmingham, Alabama, when they bombed the church with Ada Mae and the other girls in it, you know, the Black working class, so-called lumpen, they started to burn down the city, but nobody talks about that. So if the resistance has an emotional content, but also a physical pushback, then somehow that gets disappeared. But the Panthers remembered all that. You know, as children, they would have seen or heard about Emmett Till in his coffin and how he was tortured. They would have remembered that was 55, 63, the bombing that followed Martin Luther King's speech the month after of I Have a Dream on the Washington Mall. And, you know, the racist, like we're going to turn the dream into a nightmare. So as children growing up, they remember and they track the atrocities. You can't erase it from their memories. So by the time they're teenagers in their early 20s, and you shot one more, I think it was a 15-year-old in the back, the cops did, in Oakland, then they form a self-defense party. Later, they stripped off for self-defense because the FBI and the federal police forces just had marked them for extermination. But I think if we follow our lineage, and this is where I'm really interested in how you're using everybody the term of evolution. Like, tell me, are we going in a spiral or a circle? Or, I mean, what is your definition of evolution in relationship to revolution? Because the Panthers at one time thought they were a revolutionary party, and I would argue they were, and then they split. And then things became violent internally. They were violent from, again, the FBI and the state. But the one thing I want to close with, if this is part of our evolutionary trajectory, is to go back to what Zoe said about genocide. So, right, we forget what happens before the 1930s and 1940s because we're taught to forget. But in 48, the UN drafted the Convention for the Prevention and Elimination of Genocide, right? And there were a number of mass murders, but, you know, certain bodies, certain cultures became the symbol or the representation of genocide, even though genocide against indigenous across the globe is like common. So in 1951, W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson signed a petition that William Patterson crafted with the Civil Rights Congress. These are Black communists called We Charge Genocide. That was 1951. Last year on the 70th anniversary, Jericho, which is partly led by former Panthers who were in prison but got out, they had a tribunal or hearing in New York City to charge genocide again. And maybe this might be what we have in common in terms of the destruction of our communities and the betrayals, both the betrayals inside the communities and the external betrayals. That maybe if we have a common language, you know, not that I trust the UN because it's based in New York City, but if we have a common language of confronting genocide, maybe then we understand the carceral apparatus, both in terms of prison slavery, or prison abolition, slavery abolition, anti-colonial, or the abolition of colonialism, the abolition of violence against women, children, LGBTQ communities, and the abandonment that follows that violence. Maybe we take the definition of genocide, we re-engineer it so it definitely meets our needs, and then we see if we can track evolutionary or revolutionary struggle.
Thank you. Berivan.
I think I can also add to Joy at this point, as we can also talk about the incarceration and mass incarceration of the Black people and the Indigenous people. As I live in Canada also, we can talk about the overrepresentation of the Indigenous women and Black populations in Canadian prisons, as well as in Turkish context, the almost 10,000 political prisoners we are talking about as Kurdish political prisoners, and the women and the mayors, MPs, activists, and all of them. But what I would like to mention here, when we are talking about the historical genocide, the mass incarceration, we are just also, as we thought, it's an exceptional. It was just, reduced to the, for example, dictatorial period or military period time. But these all periods are showing us this is the colonialism. The prisons is the tool for colonialism. This violence still going on, and the movement and the people on the ground still resisting against these colonial violence. That's why it cannot be ever, I think, historicized. When I was writing my dissertation, I just, this section is incarceration of Kurds. Okay, just try to categorize chronologically, because it goes back to the formation of the Turkish state, the mass incarceration of Kurds, and also genocides, the captivity and everything. And then, 1925 and 38, and remembering the genocide in one of the Kurdish region in Turkey, and then come to the second period and come to the third period, but the period never ends. It's still going on. And right now, I do not want to also, count all these political prisoners as numbers, but I would like to just focus more on, we shouldn't forget them. We shouldn't forget also their still ongoing struggle against the colonialism in prisons, outside the prisons, and in the circle of also prison abolition, with the families, with the activists. But also, we cannot just talk about these are the exceptional violence right now. It's happening, how we normalized. I think my point is more about when we are talking about not only Kurds, Black people, Indigenous people, this is just normalization of this violence, and also ending up in prisons. It's just, about them. It's for them. We are not talking about other people's, for example, incarceration experiences. Why still we are talking about Kurds, Palestinian, Black and Indigenous people? Why we are still thinking about the abolition for them? And even when we are talking about in our classrooms or in society, people are saying me, how you support abolition? Okay, what we're gonna do with them? What we're gonna do with them? The focus is always punishment. The focus is always defining the crime and who defines the crime. For example, again, in Kurdish context, 30 years ago, using some symbol of Kurdish nationalism, red, yellow, and green colors for your, the dresses, or red flag, or the Kurdish flag, was a crime. And the peace process period, it didn't become a crime. And right now, it's again crime. And who is innocent and what is crime, always state defines. Always state defines. And all the populations just putting into prison, by the definitions, all these crimes, I think decolonization and the prison abolition and the knowledge production around the abolition all includes also, for me, and I think for all of us, defining these terms and not forgetting them, and not marginalize also their resistance. Whenever people, for example, here, Black Panther, it's like a utopia, it's a fantasy. But in Kurdish context, the Kurdish women movement, not only in Turkey and also in Syria and Rojava in autonomous area, it's still going on. And they didn't fall from the sky, actually. It goes back to the almost 100 years ago, resistance struggle against Turkish colonialism, Iraqi colonialism, Iranian colonialism, and all of them. And also contemporary, if we are talking about the Kurdish movement in contemporary one last 40 years. It goes back to again, the 70s. How the movements also shape in these places, in these spaces. And now we are still working with them against this same colonialism, same violence in a different context, in a different geographical context, sometimes in a different forms of colonialism, as I talk about. For example, one doesn't talk about the genocide of the Yazidi people, but this is the captivity by under the ISIS. But again, it is, it happened by the extremists. No one doesn't want to connect the colonialism and the colonial violence against Kurds in Middle East, and also again the continuing violence in North America. I think I would say it's an adding point to the resistance, not forgetting them, but making connection in different contexts to seeing them and to participating them, to just not only maybe join them, but doing work with them, even not for them also. This is also another point that we as, I think, scholars, prison evolution scholars, for doing any research not for them, not on behalf of them, because they have already their agency, their voice, and even with their corporal bodies coming from their grave, their dead bodies coming from prisons, they are still fighting against colonial violence in all around the world.
Thank you, Berivan. These, such powerful reflections from all of you. And the next question here, we looked a little bit into history. So the next theme to discuss, and you brought many, from massacres, genocides, and maybe genocide is the common language, genocides of our people that happened, that took place in different forms. And though, as Berivan was saying, it's like, well, those genocidal periods are over, but what is in place now? And, you mentioned Black Panthers, we're talking about Kurdish political prisoners, we're talking about decolonization in Africa and, the ongoing settler colonial relationships. And, so it's, and Joyce's question is still on the table. Is it evolution? In what direction is this happening? So, but my next question was about the more contemporary, right? So we have these massacres, genocidal, and maybe we can think of imprisonment and criminalization as an ongoing process of genocidal state projects, right? Racial, carceral project. But what is in the contemporary, right? There's also specificities of each era, of each period. So can we discuss then today, is criminalization, imprisonment central to the colonial politics, colonial power relations? Is criminalization, imprisonment, has it become the new genocide? Or, or just another leg of like, how do we see the specificity of this particular form of violence? And also in terms of evolution, then how is evolution central to decolonization, if we think of it in that sense? If this is the central form of colonial politics, then what is evolution? How should we understand evolution? Is evolution decriminalization? And how evolution is central to struggles of freedom, to revolutionary struggles of freedom then?
I think there are layers here that everybody, put on the table, right? That sort of point to the complexity. First, as a person of African descent, we're criminalized before we even walk into a jail or prison. That's how you get George Floyd dying on the street like that, calling for his mother. That's how you get Breonna Taylor shot up in her bed, right? While she's sleeping. And so the state, it's sort of I'm always struck by capitalism, and everything has a price tag, but it's attempt to reconcile with its predatory actions is to offer monetary compensation. That's one, so, we murdered one of y'all. So we're going to give the family this much money. And it's not just the state, it's also the nonprofits. You know, since the last uprising, or whatever it's going to be described as, a lot of money got flooded in, hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion. So I think the violence coexists with the market. And there's a marketplace for reining in the desire to be free from these forms of intimidation and dispossession of community, of land, as pointed out, but also labor, right? So much of what goes on in the US, I mean, we spent $5 billion to incarcerate about 2 million people. And then you make them work, but they don't have any work protections. And, you know, people get maimed, you know, doing butcher, you know, cutting up animals for, you know, private corporations, or reproducing the prison. So there's a land acknowledgement, what I think is important for Indigenous. Sorry if I'm roaming with my response, but the labor acknowledgement is critical too, because incarceration itself is a mechanism for labor exploitation. And that doesn't register when we start talking about unions, as important as they are. Starbucks, people should be able to unionize. But there's another layer of exploitation, as well as a layer of expendability. And I think this registers for all activists, that if you continue to rebel in a certain way to assert autonomy, a desire to be free or have sovereignty, the possibility of another kind of layer of hell will be the carceral zone. And we knew it, you know, from hundreds of years of enslavement. And then you have the 13th Amendment for the US Constitution, which is supposed to be the premier democracy. So slavery is legal in the United States if you've been duly convicted of crime. So it's like, oh, we're back in the 1700s or 1800s again. Yeah, you are. If you have no legal protections, that's a short version. The other thing is we have a right-wing Supreme Court. I mean, the US democracy was always dysfunctional, but now it's not going to work for white middle-class people either. I mean, it was okay to be dysfunctional if it was like Black, Indigenous, Chicano, you know, but like the way in which the state laws are going around reproductive rights or abortion, if you terminate a pregnancy, that becomes a homicide. So you can expect more women going to prison, right? So the state's predatory moves are expanding. How are our movements expanding to connect with the state? And since the state is also an international or imperial project, how do we have layers of linkages or ties that also means all of our work also has to have an international perspective or scope? I think, I mean, I'm not pessimistic about it, it's just an assessment. I think whatever happened in the 70s, 60s, that we thought these gains, you know, reproductive rights, civil rights, we didn't anticipate, or we were not taught to anticipate and prepare that the reactionaries and the proto-fascists would destroy all those gains as soon as they could. It took them 50 years, and that's a long time, but it's not really a long time if you're looking for an imperial project with stratification, in which some people are fully human and others are just edibles.
If I can kind of jump on what Joy said, I really appreciate you bringing up the Civil Rights Congress's We Charge Genocide petition, because of the way that they were trying to internationalize this understanding of genocide to not be this kind of rigid and bounded, time-bound event, but to think about it as being processual, to think about it as being as being inextricably linked to colonial materiality. So they talk about, the state of African American life and the way that lifespans are being decreased and segregation, but they also connected to the Korean War. They connected to all of these other imperial wars, and that's why the United States was so terrified, and why the United States was so adamant about dismissing its legitimacy of any kind, because it might then it would necessarily implicate the state as being a part of Black genocide in the United States. Because if we know that law enforcement and other members of government are a part of the Klan, and they're actively participating in these lynch mobs, and they're actively participating in these acts of violence, then there are all of these ways all of a sudden of implicating the nation state in these processes of genocide, as opposed to this kind of norm that is established by Nuremberg, that genocide is, and again, to Berivan's point of these extremist moments, that genocide is implicated by actors, by people who are happen to be governing a state, but it is not a part of the state's internal logics and the state's means of sustaining itself. I mean, when we did, I had the honor and pleasure of guest editing an issue of the Funambulist, and the issue was against genocide, and I really tried to use the editorial note to really rethink how we understand genocide, and to rethink how we understand this idea of crime. And one of the contributions that I was really excited to have was this Armenian photojournalist, Nazak Armanakian, and some of the portfolio that she had taken in Artsakh during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. And it was really powerful for me to see the ways that she was photographing all of these different Azerbaijani and Turkish state-sponsored weapons landing on the streets and everything. And it was also really powerful and really kind of terrifying to see the way that Armenians were talking about it as this continuation of the Ottoman genocide beginning in 1915 and even preceding, with all of these different massacres in the 1890s and the early 1900s. And so it really drove home to me this idea of yes, these larger historical processes, but the need for the state to adapt, to transform its kind of tactics. So instead of a kind of maybe outright assault on Armenians, the Turkish state is supporting, Azerbaijan is supporting all of these different Erdogan is denying the genocide. There's this pan-Turkic, land-based aspiration for the region. Because these kind of outright, in some contexts, these outright genocidal campaigns have much greater geopolitical implications and consequences than they used to. And so, we see, as Joy, was describing with the abolition of slavery, there is this new labor market created by the expansion of the prison industrial complex. And I think that what we need to learn, and I think that this speaks to maybe an American over belief in, over subscription to constitutionalism, is this idea that there is no such thing as a right that is inalienable. Your rights only exist in as much as you have someone willing to interpret your rights in a way that actually benefits you, in a way that actually upholds them. And I'm really appreciative of, Boaventura de Sousa Santos' idea of societal fascism, where he talks about pre and post contractual exclusion. And you have, in all of these different contexts that we're talking about, people who were never intended to be a part of the social contract. But then you also have people who, and which is basically everyone else, except for kind of capitalist classes, people who can be excluded from the social contract and removed from the social contract, which is what we're seeing over the past, handful of decades, with the erosion of voting rights, with these encroachments on bodily autonomy and sovereignty with regards to gender, with regards to abortion, and I don't know if it means that we need to study the ways that movements have understood the nature of the state, have understood the nature of fascism. I don't know if it means that we need new kinds of political programs, but it just really worries me when people describe history as repeating itself, as opposed to, violences just evolving and reiterating in different ways. There's no repetition, there is simply continuity. With Joy describing the kind of the reinfleshment of genocidal violence in Europe that was first originated in the colony. There are simply reiterations and transformations and adaptations that the state is able to use in order to successfully tamp down on resistances and popular struggles. And we have to really think about imprisonment as being an important part of that. And I mean, when we look at prison writings from the 1960s, George Jackson was very clear about fascism and carcerality. And yeah.
Thank you. Berivan, please.
I would like to join this last discussion, Joy and Zoe, you brought. I would like to give some very, simple example how I actually learn how colonialism works against Kurds when I was doing my research, even all my experiences and my activism, my work around this. But how in my research, the Kurdish women political prisoners, and especially one of them, she's assassinated, Sarikaya in Paris in 2013. She was always talking about the legitimacy of the Turkish courts, Turkish colonial courts, and she's the first person in Kurdish history made a political defense as a Kurdish woman. And unfortunately, I couldn't reach out her defense. I am definitely sure it's almost 100 pages because we also had access for the other martyrs' political defense, and how they are talking about the Turkish colonialism, genocide, mass incarceration, and the violence against, and the surveillance, torture against Kurdish people. I learned all from them. I learned, for example, again, in Sarikaya Johnson's one of the court, and she was saying, I'm a revolutionary. You cannot just threaten me just by raping, by killing me, because my idea is still living with me. And it will live, and it will also guide the next generations, the following generations. And I hope I don't think, I'm also a little bit pessimist like Joy. I don't think I will also see the revolution in my lifetime, neither my daughter, maybe a couple of generations later, we will see. We are still, as Kurds, struggling and killing and murdering. But these learnings coming from these political defenses or their experiences in prison, in courts, but I realized that the imprisonment doesn't work by itself. It also works with health system. It also works with the state needs all apparatus to condemn all these violence and everything against Kurds. And Kurdish political prisoners, they have very sharp ideas about the legal system, even 40 years ago. But right now we are still talking about the illegality and legality and the legal politics. What does it mean? What does it mean, the illegal politics? It's anti-colonial struggle itself. It's the legal politics itself. It's the justified struggle against the colonialism. But when we are coming to this era and also talking about the mass incarceration and coming back to the abolition, it's the always question, is abolition is decriminalization, de-imprisonment, de-incarceration, whatever. But for me, I think that we need to talk about, it's the international struggle. Abolition, it's the international struggle that we need to connect. The Black people's struggle, the Kurdish people's struggle, and in the incarceration context. But this is the thing that we need to still focus on, their resistance, all these people's resistance when we are talking about the abolition. But if we differ or make a differentiate in between in terms of colonial violence, in terms of, again, how it occur as a genocide, as a mass incarceration, as a, the on the street and criminalization and open air prisons, as in Turkey and happening in Palestine, I think we, again, still just missing the point of why we need abolition, to make this connection, to create this solidarity, I think. If we only focus about because never and never, even 40 years ago, political prisoners, they don't call themselves as victims, even not survivors. They said, I'm here with my all political consciousness, with my will, and they're ready for everything. And same as now for the Kurdish political prisoners in prison, even, they just posting in Facebook against the Erdogan, just charges 6 years in Turkey, but people are still continually, doing all these so-called crimes. The thing is here, it's not only talking about victimization and the oppression, to call the abolition for me, to call the transnational solidarity in between them for each of us. I think that I would like to mention here.
Thank you so much. What great reflections. What important connections. There's, we're following, just to let the audience know, we're following with a set of discussion questions that are prepared, and then we'll have a little time for the Q&A, hopefully. But it's just so important. Berivan mentions Sakine Cansız, and as the moderator, I don't want to say much, but it's so close to my heart. And she brings these discussions of massacre, genocide, imprisonment, and the ongoing criminalization of the Kurdish movement. For example, this is the context I'm familiar with. It's such an eliminatory case because, and issues of memory, because just one person's story can really illuminate it all. And I want to suggest that because Sakine Cansız is someone who's actually from Dersim region within Bakur, Kurdistan, that's under the Turkish colonial rule. And she's from Dersim, which witnesses the 1938 genocide, which is the largest genocidal project against the Kurdish Alevi people by the Turkish state. And the memories of this genocide, she talks about it in how it politicized a certain generation. And this is a generation that became politicized in the 60s, 70s. And then she goes into prison in the 80s. She becomes, a very important figure of the Kurdish freedom movement. And also very critical of this notion of legality and defending our movements and resistance within the bounds of legal order that is defined by the colonial, imperial, racial states. So this figure alone really connects many questions, and also, both, if you look at her trajectory, then you see the criminalization, the genocide against the Kurdish Alevi population in the 1930s, large scale, right? We talk about tens of thousands of people being killed in a matter of a month, and displacement. Zoe talked about land, right? This particular form of displacement of people, and then their imprisonment, but their struggles, because then you have in the same geography, you have the emergence, the vibrant revolutionary movements of the 60s, 70s that then became criminalized by the state. Then you have the Kurdish freedom movement spreading there, and it became criminalized. And also states, both legal borders of the states are problematic, obviously, are to repress us, to oppress our movements, but also states are clever to come with different rules. Sometimes it becomes a rule of exception. So that is why it's very important for me, the story of Sakine Cansız, because the same Dersim was defined and separate laws were defined just defined it in the 1930s to massacre, to lead way to massacres and genocide. And again, in the 1980s and 90s, Turkish state comes up with states of exception, rules of exception to, as Joy mentioned, you said, we are, on the time we step into the street, we're criminalized. We don't have to be going, we don't have to be put in prison. And the same for Kurds, the same for Palestinians, right? Your bare existence is a crime and you are pulled. And maybe I had to speak here, even though I didn't want to as the moderator, because I was born in Dersim. I grew up in Dersim. And I witnessed and I experienced checkpoints. I experienced the terror at the hands of the Turkish state, being stopped, being frisked, being, criminalized. And as a kid, as Joy was saying, our kids are criminalized, our kids are killed, right? That as a kid, I had like a police officer walking into my classroom with guns, the special forces of the military walking in the classrooms with guns. So this type of terrorizing, but then using discourses of crime and terrorism to punish, to imprison our movements, our people. And thank you so much. And I'm sorry for taking the space, but I wanna enter then into, because this is a seminar series on decolonization, Rojava University, Rojava, this revolutionary space, this revolutionary place, which I think, despite the hopelessness, brings some hope that its survival, its existence, this bare seminar taking place under, Rojava University, despite many threats and ongoing violence against Rojava by the Turkish state, by the Syrians, so it's, and its vibrancy. And the seminar series is about knowledge and how to produce alternative knowledge, how to produce decolonial spaces. So I want to just have a question on that to all the panelists. Can the university be a space for engagement with revolutionary thought? And also from your experiences as movement intellectuals, what has been your experiences in the current university spaces, but also what would be the space, the place, the ideal place for freedom and free thought, evolutionary knowledge dissemination, right? To have some hope, some visionary imaginaries of how you would envision such a space, such a place. Is there anyone who wants to jump in? We don't need to go in the orders we started.
I can jump.
Please, Berivan.
When I saw the question you already, you have sent to us, and the first impression for me, how the political prisoners turns prison into universities. That's why, do we really need these universities to disseminate this knowledge production, because they're already coming from prisons? And then, as of course, scholar and teaching in the academia, and also thinking about how we are developing our curriculum, our syllabus, also how we are just going to do some job interviews and the questions that we are getting about our work. It just, all of them, when I'm thinking about all of them just together, I just realized that, first of all, these Kurdish political prisoners, intellectuals, thoughts, and their writings, and never and ever, in Canadian context, I can say that, in my curriculum. Maybe it can be one of the topic, but what I found in academia, most of the time, these are uncomfortable topics. For example, in one of the job interview, when I was talking about decolonization and also prison abolition that I'm interested in, and the reflection was, these are a little bit uncomfortable for our students. And who are your students then? They're all white Canadian students, but on the other hand, in these academic contexts, they're always talking about, the decolonize the academia, and where you can start to decolonize the academia, first of all, to hire those BIPOC people, including us, for example. But these BIPOC peoples also teaches what? In these, again, very colonial spaces, colonial academia, that that's why I just separated the academia for me in prisons and also the official, the colonial spaces, the academia that I'm working in. Why? What I am trying to get these knowledge from prisons, the turn to these, the oppressive spaces turned already by political prisoners as a resistance spaces and also academic spaces, because they have their circles. I remember almost 30 years ago in prisons, we were sending the Fanons and the Paulo Freire, the Pedagogy of Oppressed, and all the philosophical, the books and everything, even Foucault and Erving Goffman, for example. But I realized in academic settings, why I need Foucault to articulate already, all these lived experiences, and they are already telling me theory. They're already, that's why even when I was writing my research, it was kind of problematic for my committee because I didn't have a theory section. But I said, if I'm talking about all these lived experiences, these experiences already are theory. Why we need, even I have also critique for Foucault, for Erving Goffman, that they're all talking about the imprisonment and the captivity and these spaces, for example, mental institutions, how, even the prisons also produce disabled bodies and all of things. But Sakine Johnson's memoir itself, or all these political defenses can also teach us that I understand the colonialism and violence and the historically captivity in Kurdish resistance history and everything. But what we were expected, or what we are still expected to teach Foucault, to teach other, the white male thinkers, even on decolonialism. No one doesn't talk about the decolonial feminist or native feminist scholars' work. They are, again, very uncomfortable. If you're reading colonialism with a gender lens, gender aspect, and also the ideology comes here, in academic settings also, your seems just always biased because you are talking about movement, and it means you're biased and you're not so-called objective. But what does it mean, this objectivity? In these colonial settings, I can understand. But if there is a claim that we are decolonizing the academia, that's why we would like to work with you guys, these BIPOC peoples. And then how you can talk about the objectivity, how you can see in these peoples, Black peoples, indigenous people, when they are talking about the oppression, about their people, it comes from the community. It doesn't come from nowhere. It's not nowhere in the middle of, something. This is real and out there on the table, they're talking about it, but you seem as biased. That's why I am pessimistic. In academia, I don't see these kinds of, the topics, politics that we can teach. And I did. I also taught decolonizing feminisms. And I was expected only focus on the indigenous feminism in Canadian context, which is understandable. But I try to, again, coming back to why we are doing this evolution work, to make a connection, to create this transnational solidarity in between all these folks. And I just try to, I taught, for example, Zapatista women, Kurdish women, Palestinian women, Chicana women, Black women, and then indigenous women. Then I had also indigenous students, Black students, white Canadian students, even people of color students. They all got these, the examples or some related topics related to their life, their background. And I'm still getting some very good feedbacks. Oh, this course changed my life. But I'm definitely sure by the program of this university, I will not be asked again to teach this course in this way. I'm definitely sure about that. Again, these are uncomfortable topics, prison abolition. Why? Why we need this? What we're gonna do, these all rapists, for example. And the carceral feminism, when I was critique, for example, I had a critique about the carceral feminism. Again, you cannot talk about the abolition feminism. These are all very, it seems still very marginalized, utopian, and in academic context. But in activism, these are even, I think they also see us pacifist, we don't do nothing in the activism area, in prison area, for example. What are you doing? Are you only writing? Are you only just talking about in your class? I am living all these things here on the ground in these cells. But what's your role as abolition scholars, for example? Just again, this authoritarian way, or again, we can also talk about the decolonizing methodologies. Just Linda Smith always reminds us, who are we? If I'm not using, for example, the word of research for the native people, it's very, it's dirty words when you're using research, and who is the research subject, and the commodity and everything, and the fetishization of the indigenous people experiences and everything. That's why I'm saying, okay, it's inquiry, and it's activist-based inquiry, and it's responsibly, ethically inquiry. I will try to use these terms when I am doing some work with them. But still, who are us and what are we doing for them as a scholar in these colonial settings? Even the last class, I remember I said that, I don't want you to use Dr. Sarikaya anymore. I would like to just erase all these, the titles that the colonial academic settings just impose us. There was shock. They are shocked, actually, that someone just calling them, we're same and we are doing the same job here or something like that. These are that I would like to add about the academic settings and revolutionary thoughts. I never just experienced in Canada, maybe in Turkey, not right now, maybe sometimes, the peace periods times or after military junta period. I remember also in some academic settings, we were reading some prisoner memoirs, for example. And now I'm also thinking that why the prison memoirs cannot be validated as a data. Again, do we need to really go to the so-called fields? What's field, for example? What's research? What's field? Why we are doing these ethnographic jobs for them again? I think I would like that point.
Thank you, Berivan. Zoe, Joy?
I can go because I feel like Joy is gonna punctuate our comments with the way that she engages the Academy in her work. But I appreciate her in the very beginning talking about describing academia as a paycheck, because I think my only relatively healthy relationship to academia has come through kind of disinvesting in its existence as an institution, and seeing I enjoy teaching, I enjoy my research, but recognizing that in any kind of real anti-colonial, decolonial project, it's something that cannot exist as a mode of knowledge production, that, there's this top-down kind of banking method of teaching, where we're teaching students how to learn in order to become good workers in a particular way. And then the knowledge about communities who are given, we create these kind of economies with this ethnographic research that Berivan described. And then when our research is done, those economies go away and there's no longer some source of kind of money and income for people who become reliant on these kinds of projects. And then they never see the results of the work that, their life stories and traumas and everything, are extracted from them in order to produce. I think in writing my dissertation, I think that what really helped me was to stop kind of thinking about this idea of like alternative knowledges. that there is the kind of epistemological, methodological practice that I should be engaging in. And for a little bit of spice, I'll throw in a little bit of indigenous something something in order to ground this real theory and something of kind of topical relevance. And what was really useful and really what made my work more difficult actually was realizing that the ways that Ovo Herero and Nama people think about death, think about ancestors, think about the need to repatriate, the urgency actually really in repatriating skulls that are still held in German and American and other Western institutions is so similar to the way that, you know, my own culture in Zimbabwe also thinks about death, and really, you know, that being my approach and that being the ways that I understand urgency and the way that I understand memory has been incredibly powerful. And to refuse to subordinate that kind of lived experiential community-based understanding as community-based understanding, as opposed to a metaphysics that is authoritative, not even worth engaging, right? An experience that is authoritative, its own kind of grounded theoretical understanding of the way the world works and the way of understanding violence and the way of understanding power and everything else. And so I think the university, it's been useful in exposing me to certain kinds of ideas, but then I also wonder if the university didn't exist and we understood all of these different forms of knowledge as also being real knowledge, like would I need the university to be the space that gives me this knowledge that I understand as being useful? Would not these prison scholars be enough? The experiences of relatives who fought in struggles, people who don't necessarily have the language that we recognize as being like real and valid, you know, describing their experiences, describing their participation in movements, in armed struggles, whatever. I think knowledge would be, I think, much more democratic in the absence of the university. And so I guess since I'm here, since I do have this job, I guess I wonder how I can think about knowledge being as democratic within the classroom space as I can make it, figuring out as many ways of getting students access to ideas, to resources, and then being able to support them in disseminating those resources and ideas to their communities, however the communities are deciding that they desire them. Because I think Berivan's point about, you know, what are you doing? Are you just still writing? Is really important, even as we do feel like the things that we're writing are important, and they do feel urgent and important to me. But I also wonder, you know, for example, in the fall, I'm teaching a class about the kind of production of images of war. Like, what does it mean that I'm teaching students how to develop a sense of like visual literacy when these wars are still ongoing? And how can I, in the kind of incredibly constrained space of the classroom, communicate the urgency in solidarity with these different peoples, as opposed to just kind of using the violence that they experience as a case study for understanding how the world works, which is so often how struggles enter the classroom, right? There's this learning to know, this learning to commodify, as opposed to thinking about not how to participate so much as how to similarly adopt and to how to similarly act and to engage beyond the kind of scholarship, despite, again, the scholarship being important in its own way. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I appreciate what Berivan and Zoe put on the table. I mean, when I think of the academy, maybe because, you know, I've been in it for decades as an industry, you know, I see two prominent zones. One is the state, which are the public universities, which logically are an extension of government. I mean, they literally are, right? And then the second would be the private entities. And then I kind of, for whatever reasons, ended up in the elite sector of that zone. But those are corporations. So like under US capitalism, I know there are a lot of other zones But the two primary would be, you know, it's government or it's corporation. And in the US, the government and corporation work hand in hand. So there's zones that you could carve out spaces or niches and be creative and actually not feel like you're totally exhausted or betraying your own intellect and ethics, right? And portraying the gifts of your students. But I'm always careful about that because those are zones that you've carved out inside of a state or a corporate edifice. And I don't see tangible struggles to take over those. I mean, you can't take over the state. I mean, you can have a protest, but you can't take over a state university without defeating the state. So we haven't had a revolutionary struggle to change the state. So its educational sites are going to reflect, you know, that's how you get all these layers of administrators, like provosts and I mean, it's just more and more corporate. There's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of money that goes to those salaries for administrators who are not teachers anymore. However, they started off, they don't teach, they manage personnel and they police protocol. There's some, you know, they're wonderful people, you know, inside these zones who are committed. And so I'm being redundant about this one. But like I've said before, I mean, it's tricky, especially like if you're working with the people who are incarcerated, because there's a power imbalance because you're the academic and they're not. And like I said, you know, the incarcerated can't say, you know, I shared my stories, you messed it up, and now you're not going to get tenure. Or I'm going to, you know, your book is going to be pulled. You know, they can't, they have no power over you, right? And those kinds of relationships with power imbalances are very difficult to navigate. Even when you're taking hits because you're doing the right thing, you still have structural power over people who need to be connected to the academy in order, you know, to provide them some zone of being less terrorized or being disappeared. Like if your name's out there and academics are talking about you, then, you know, maybe you don't go in solitary confinement, or maybe you don't, quote, have an accident inside of prison or, you know, in the hospital wing or something like that, because the external world sees that you have value. But then if your value is your prose or your personal narrative, I'm still struggling with how that doesn't become a commodity in a market. So the way I think, I mean, so I was trained in Western European philosophy, dissertation on Hannah Arendt. Never really, she wasn't that interesting to me, but I never really pursued it, right? But I'm reading all the Europeans, but if I think differently from most, it's not because the academy trained me. Like anything creative or useful in my work did not come from academia. So I'm wondering how we could understand value and link it to the source. And I would argue the source is not the government and it's not the corporation. So how do we protect the source? How do we protect community? And again, I'm going back to what Zoe said about how do we remember? How do we like understand the value of memory? So if the Al Jazeera journalist, if she's murdered in Palestine, right? And then you're going to have some hearings that took a long time for them just to agree that, you know, shot by an Israeli soldier. How do you want to remember that and teach that? And for me, we're going to do what we're supposed to do because we're committed. But I'm wondering if we're prepared for the backlash. You know, as Berivan said, you know, they're not going to ask me to teach the course again. But that's legit because what you're doing is teaching them to critique structure while they're embedded in structure. which means you're testing their loyalty to it. And you're demonstrating that you're not really all that loyal to it. It's just, it's paying your bills, feeding your kids. I would really like to see how we could honor the intellectual sites that are not academic. And I'm very wary, again, of all this nonprofit foundation money flooding into, quote, left ideas that are anchored in the academy. They originate from outside the academy, but they only can be anchored with wealth and prestige. It's kind of like Zoe brought up George Jackson, and I'm totally fascinated, Zoe, why people, your generation, you're like the third person who's mentioned Jackson this week to me. And I'm like, okay, what's going on? People are writing books on George Jackson. And I'm like, how does this even work? Because he's a militarist, right? And we would never publicly say that we are, and largely because we're not. But what does it mean to open the door to study resistance in very serious ways in an academy that wants order, structure, order, productivity lines, degrees being churned out, and books on the shelf and in the marketplace?
Thank you so much, all. I mean, this is, Berivan, if you probably got a chance to respond, after this, we know that this is something that, for example, the Kurdish movement right now needs to watch out for, because we're not there yet. Because as of now, right, we can't say the PKK, or we can't say Sakine Cansız in the colonial settings that criminalize the Kurdish movement. So the ongoing criminalization, and as Joe is saying, probably if I continue to teach George Jackson any longer, my university will be aware of it, because also like in the context that you teach. So one thing I do is I usually start with other contexts, and they get familiarized, and they're like, okay, now I can question, right? Like if you give the example of the PKK in the US, they understand, okay, there's colonial violent state, and that this is a decolonial, anti-colonial freedom movement. But then from there, right, it takes a while for my students to get to understand that Black Panthers and George Jackson and these other notions of self-defense and abolition in the US, because they're based in the US, because there's ideology, right? And people we interact with, we engage with, even those sometimes who call themselves leftists, even those, for example, in the Kurdish academia, we can't freely use the word colonialism to define the Kurdish existence within under these colonial states. So there is, but thanks to you, we know that even when you get there, then that doesn't mean then there's capitalism, right? That then your movements can be commodified, your memory can be commodified. And so how do you resist that? For example, the genocide of 1938, at some point during the peace process between the PKK and Turkey, became public for the first time in history. But then quickly, the boundaries of how you can define it were set by the state, by the capitalist structure of like what you can sell about this, what you cannot say about this. And it's the danger of taming the movements, taming knowledge that's out there, that we should get your examples and watch out for. I want to say if the panelists have something to add to this conversation before I open it to the Q&A, or we can open it to the Q&A and then you can bring these other free reflections as well. But thank you so much so far. So we have a couple of questions. I'll read two at a time. Does that work for you? Okay. So the first question is, Joy mentioned the word evolution, and they want to know more about evolution in the context of abolition. What did you mean, what you had in mind, Joy? So that's to Joy. The second question As Joy mentioned, it took 50 years to undo much of the Cultural Revolution in the US, and this was a strategic effort. Is it possible to envision evolution in some of these longer time scales? Evolution deals with undoing colonial systems. How do we ensure evolution is not just about addressing power and communicates a positive political program that will not be easily subverted? I guess the second question could be for you all. Joy, do you want to start with?
Yeah, so actually I had posed a question, right? Because the language that we're using is about evolution. And I wasn't clear about the distinction between evolution and revolution. And I've already wrote something a couple of years ago questioning if abolition was coming like a surrogate for revolutionary struggle. So it'd be easier to wrap our heads around abolition and say abolition instead of saying revolution. Because like this state is like, excuse me? You're talking about revolution. But if you're going to talk about abolition, it's pretty much an open container. And it's not even the state as its police apparatus, but also the ideologues, and the pundits and the commentators, like, oh, we can talk about abolition and, oh, it's kind of naive or it's like novel or da-da-da. But revolution pretty much is like, oh, we have to address the billionaires. We have to address the it's so old school in a way that you understand that it has repercussions to the economy and to the use of violence as structural, predation. Whereas evolution and abolition seems to me to be, I'm not saying they don't have content, but they seem to be kinder language, right? And more flexible or fungible. Because my argument is like, which abolitionism are you talking about? There's probably like multiple forms of abolitionists and they don't agree, right? And so the last thing, is saying, if you want to check it out, there's the doctoral students did a roundtable on the captive maternal. And, they were from all over and, South Africa and other zones. But they asked some really important questions in terms of where's this going and where's this language going? And at the same time, they were making it very clear that the language was not working for them.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, the other question, maybe others can get started on that.
Ozlem, can you repeat it again, the second question, please?
Sure. So I'll try to summarize a little bit, if that's okay. So as Joy mentioned, it took 50 years to undo much of the Cultural Revolution in the US. This was a strategic effort. So can we think of how do we ensure evolution is not just about addressing power and communicates a political program that will not be subverted?
I don't think it's possible for abolition to not get subverted, unfortunately. And I think that the thing that the state has done most successfully is the absorption of critique. And then a kind of repackaging and then redistributing some kind of program or some kind of gesture that mimics the critique in hopes that that will kind of sufficiently pacify the people who are making calls for anything. I mean, I'm just looking at what has come out of 2020 and all of the protests following George Floyd's murder. I'm looking at the way that all of these different municipalities were talking about reallocating funds from policing into anything else. And yet what we're seeing now 2 years later is that none of the municipality, or for the most part, have actually done what they claimed they were going to do, and in fact have allocated more funding to policing. Like, I'm pretty sure the NYPD police budget at this point is like a small country. And so I think abolition or whatever kind of revolutionary politics in that necessarily has to be a longer time scale, because I think abolition is not just about destruction. It has to also be about creation or recreation. It has to be about trying to figure out how to materialize these kind of micro relations, these new ways of making life, these new ways of interacting, these new ways of producing care, which requires us to completely unlearn and re-socialize ourselves into social modes that are not about these like punitive responses to harm, and thinking about preventative measures and the prevention of crime, so to speak, that revolve around like ensuring people have access to services, ensuring that people are safe, and developing a politic of safety outside of policing and a reliance on prisons. And I think the kind of revolutionary or abolitionist imagination is it's a difficult project, because the thing about conservatives, as much as there's this kind of weird liberal insistence that conservatives aren't well read, they're incredibly well read. They are astute students of history, because the thing about these kind of reactionary, fascistic, whatever programs and projects is that they're simply, all they have to do is return to a point in time, is return to a point in which the social contract does not make space for whatever kinds of undesirables, and that these undesirables can be sufficiently managed, regulated, incarcerated, whatever. And so, whereas the project that I think that we're all kind of invested in is like this much more dramatic change. I think about in learning about the Zapatistas, like, initially they were like, we're taking arms against the Mexican state. And they're like, actually, that's not the moves. And they created this self-sufficient community with its own kind of governing logics, its own politics of transnational solidarity. And I think that for me has been a real kind of inspiration in thinking about what it means to materialize abolition. But yeah, the scale has to be outside of the way that political science understands the kind of typical lifespans and scales of empire. Like, it has to be its own temporality, because if you're trying to build a new world, there's kind of no real prefabricated rubric to follow in order to put it together.
Can I ask, so I'm sorry to jump in. So Zoe, can I ask you a question? So are you talking about autonomous zones? And if you are, or Maranaj, either one of those two, both entities suggest to me that they exist beyond the capacity of abolition.
Zoe, you are muted.
Oh, sorry. I think it's all kinds of things. And I mean, I'm an anarchist, and so for me, I take kind of solace in the fact that abolition can be taken up in so many different ways, that it can look like Rojava, that it can look like the Zapatista project, that it can look like these, communal spaces elsewhere, that it can look like these communal land projects. So I think, yeah, I guess for me, the kind of operative concept is autonomy in abolition.
I think I can also jump, Joy, your question. Are we really imagining this abolition or abolitionist work in autonomous area? That at least we have a proof that sometimes it gives me a hope in what's happening in Rojava, and the women self-defense units, and, writing their constitutions, and the community, the incarcerated. Of course, there are still some so-called crimes again in this region also, for example, honor killing, forced marriage, or theft, or robbery, or something like that. But I think the focus for them is not the punishment, it's more healing. It's more, engaging them to the community, but we're talking about 5 million people and under war zones, and there's no state. And also, again, in these carceral capitalist states like US, that their also maintenance of its existence is rely on the carcerality, those states. How we can imagine abolition? I think it's a still big question. But I think what these carceral states, US and Turkey, what they try to do, to crush the political imagination. But the political imagination is still there, that we need the focus. That's my understanding from abolition. Other than that, we can't just dismantle in a couple of months all the prisons and the legal system. We are talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of colonialism, and its apparatus works against all these dissidents, colonized people in all around the world. That's my abolition understanding, just, thinking about political imagination and also changing, maybe dismantling our minds before going to the institutions like prisons, for example. Because how do we really imagine? I am not calling myself anarchist, but do we really imagine there is a different kinds of world that we can still create? As we see in Rojava, as we see in Zapatista, in some autonomous areas, they only give us a hope that it's still, we need to, I think, keep them.
There was a question actually just on that, which you started addressing, is abolition, not thinking of it only as evolution of things, but as life-affirming institutions, as a call for insisting on life, and which, you've started addressing. And with the example of Rojava and these other spaces, Zapatistas, right? And the reactionaries always come up with ready critiques, because there is to criticize, right? There's a lot to criticize. You were talking, as Berivan was saying, about dismantling a whole capitalist, patriarchal, racial state logic. So, and the movements try, and that's why I actually wanted to bring in the words of a revolutionary in Rojava, Foza Yusuf, whom I had some exchanges with. She talked about how in their case, it is an ongoing revolution on a daily basis in terms of creating institutions, and creating institutions based on need, because you don't know what you need when you start, but that you start and you see a need opening, and it's different than the envisioning of the state. So as you build, it's something new, but that is being produced and reproduced, revolution happening every day on a daily basis. And so, and maybe the same about abolition and building institutions could be taught in that framework as well.
I agree. I would just add, or maybe it's not necessary to add, but I want to underscore, whatever we preserve and build, we have to defend. And I think, at least in the US, the left, I've just put air quotes around that, we're not very good at defense. Like, we build things and we imagine things, we write things, and it's just like, okay, now we're gonna, no, that's not how it works. Your opposition is heavily armed, has more money, controls propaganda networks, and it's embedded in the state and proto-fascism. There's nothing you build that they will not try to burn down. So I'm all for abolition, evolution, I'm for everything, right? But increasingly I'm asking, so what's the security apparatus look like? When I ask that question, there's never a real response. And so I'm starting to think that there's not supposed to be one. And not just like, you don't tell the public what your security habit, it's like, do you even have one? And I feel like the language and the rhetoric, and I'm not saying here on this panel, just my perception, that the aspirational aspect of it has overwhelmed the analytical. And I don't need hope to fight. And I'm not me personally, but the people I know. I mean, if you just talk to people who've been in political incarceration for 49 years and just got out 2 years ago, or they're leaving them to die, from cancer, and, they've been inside 50 years. I mean, I don't even know what hope means for certain sectors. And I don't have to know. And I don't think we have to know. We just do our job. It's like, what's your job? Do your job. But the job would have to be, if you create something, you have to protect it, like you protect your children. You don't trust the state around your kids, and you don't trust predators around your kids. So you build firewalls or some kind of network that makes sure they live long enough to grow up. And of course, there are a lot of children across the globe that don't have that opportunity. But I don't hear it often in our discussions as academics, because my argument is the academy kind of promises you structure and protection, which is really not how it's going to work if you're going to resist the structure. And so sometimes I just see academics get very comfortable because, clean water, we have food on a regular basis, the heat's on, et cetera, that the precarity and the vulnerability and the weaknesses in what we build, that doesn't get fully analyzed, because it maybe looks like we become pessimistic, or we're not inspiring people or being good soldiers. I'm like, as I said before, I grew up in a military family. The military is really good at what it does, which is basically destabilization, killing, and control of territory, because they practice. And I'm not saying we have to get, armed anything. I'm just saying conceptually, I don't think we've theorized what safety looks like outside of the aspirational, like we'll just evolve spiritually. I believe we will evolve as a people. Bureaucracies don't evolve towards compassion. They evolve towards efficiency.
Thank you, Joy. I guess I'm just, if I may, Berivan, about maybe one reason, right, that Kurdish movement has been so readily criminalized by other states. Obviously, we talk about Turkey's NATO power and it being in relationship with the US and Europe, but maybe another reason that it's been readily criminalized by countries other than Turkey has been this notion of self-defense being at the center, and that the movement starting as a guerrilla movement and producing other institutions that it went along. For example, even women's freedom, it became necessary for the PKK as early as 95 to have women's guerrilla units for self-defense. And the self-defense continues to be central in Rojava revolution. And maybe that's the reason I'm seeing that why, for example, Kurdish academics even would be so shy to engage with the PKK, would be so, even someone sympathetic. For example, there was a publication at New York Times by a Turkish scholar, and he was condemning the Turkish state's violence against the Kurds, but made sure to say, and the PKK had contributed to the bloodshed, because he has to say that, right? To delegitimize a movement which is trying to answer Joy's question of this is real. And maybe, Joy, you grew up in a military family, for example. I grew up under military surveillance in Darsim, and I know how much they surveil, right? At every block, you have checkpoints. At every hill, they establish military powers that can see the whole center, like the whole areas and villages and towns. And so, like, what do you create, and how can you create autonomous zones under that surveillance, then defending yourself and getting out of those zones in the form of, in that particular context, guerrilla movement became the only way. And so I would be, very interested in another panel to discuss maybe what in different contexts this would look like, because we are dealing with a very violent establishment. State is violent, right? It has claimed the monopoly of violence. It has criminalized people, killed those who had guns earlier on, and continues to criminalize, especially those movements who are building self-defense to defend what they can, the revolution that they have started, that they have established. I know we went on and on, but I'm just gonna see if there is another question. There's a question about, colonization. How do we overcome colonization? There's another question, how do you define and resist colonizing? What does decolonizing look like in all this discussion of evolution? There is a question about Rojava specifically, and Sardar Saadi put how evolution looks in Rojava in the chat. So for that question, maybe they can address that. But since the broader theme of the seminar series has been decolonization, colonial power, and there are some questions on that, maybe I'm gonna end with that question. What would be your reflections on how decolonization looks like, should look like, what movements you see today as perhaps decolonizing, freedom movements in the ways that you would define, you would describe that, to end the panel on that note. Zoe, do you want to get us started, since your work, right, particularly uses that language?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I think about decolonization, it has to be about land. And I think that whatever politic of decolonization we're talking about, and the irony is that, in the university, we're on the stolen land talking about decolonization. We have these indigenous remains and artifacts in the museums on the stolen land talking about decolonization. And I think there needs to be real serious contention with land politics, about the stewardship of land, about extraction, about, the criminalization of land defenders, about, long unaddressed land reform. I mean, I think I've been really inspired by different landless people's movements around the world. There's this, this project in South Africa called Abahlali Basim Jondolo, which is a shack dwellers, the shack dwellers movement, which has really done a lot to make me rethink the logics and the validities of property rights, and the ideas of what it means to have a right to shelter, a right to housing. There are also I think in Namibia, there's a landless people's movement kind of contingent that's in the arena of electoral politics that is bringing together the kind of ideas of transformative justice and thinking about the Ovaherero and Nama genocide and the dispossession of other indigenous people, and in kind of directly into conflict with the nation state through the process of elections. And so I think that, with the Segurite Land Trust in the Bay Area and people kind of giving money and paying a kind of land tax to Ohlone communities, to these communities that are kind of refusing to cede to these ideas of private property because people demand are entitled, I believe, to a place to live, to the people in Papua, the Kurds, all of these different peoples fighting for self-determination, which is about this kind of sovereign territory outside of kind of this idea of a bordered nation state. That to me is the project. Land is the project.
What I can say, I think decolonization for me, it's still a process. It's still an ongoing process to understand what's happening around us in terms of oppression, colonialism, violence, again, coming back to incarceration and dispossession, surveillance, and everything what we look for. Now I'm analyzing and everything in terms of under these colonial rules and apparatus and everything, and then just think everything again in another way, how we can see also these things in different settings, what we can create, what we can do, what we can teach, what we can talk, all this about. These are all decolonization for me, but we are always, also Zoe mentioned Eve Tuck works. decolonization is not a metaphor or cannot be a metaphor, but unfortunately, in this land, I'm also joining from a stolen land from Canada. It's a metaphor here. But for us, decolonization, for Kurds, I would say, for Black people, it's everyday resistance, it's everyday lived experiences. We are experiencing decolonization with our each cells. Even right now, I think it's a historical moment that we are talking under Rojava University. I could never imagine this type of academia that we are trying to create and we are trying to participate and we are trying to just contribute these academic knowledges just coming from Rojava with all these bloods and everything. I think for me, it's definitely historical and very emotional moment right now, joining this, this decolonization conference in Rojava University, and people are listening to us, and there's a translator over there, and we are not still using this imperialist language that we also decolonize. We have to use our native language to teach, to learn, and everything. But decolonization still will be, and the ongoing process that we need. Even the post-colonials always said that, there is no colonization anymore, okay? But for us, we can also maybe reproduce colonial relationships as colonized people also. That's why decolonization always needs, and also we need it. We need to decolonize and everything. Another point I would like to say, even in this era, we are trying to convince people around us or justify, are we colonized? What's colonialism? Is colonialism still going on? And forget about talking about decolonization. I think we have to, again, go back to the idea that colonialism is real and we are still experiencing all the, the piece of apparatus of and the everything about colonialism. That's why we need decolonization as well. I can stop here.
Thanks, Berivan and Zoe and Ozlem. So I would just say my gratitude for you pulling this all together. And three things that come to mind that we've discussed. One is this common language as a global universal one. And I think I'm going to focus more on we charge genocide, because if you look at the convention, it's the loss of language, culture, the removal of your children, that it, whether or not they want us to be able to use it, or whether or not the UN actually responds effectively. If we have a shared language that reveals our common ties, I think solidarity will be strengthened. The second is to speak about land, as Zoe has done so consistently, but I would also couple it with labor, because like the Lenape were sold, they brought them down to the Caribbean to break them, and they brought them back to now what is New Jersey. But also, our universities are not just on indigenous land, they were Georgetown, they were also built by enslaved labor. So those two, like, free the land, but also unbond the labor, and that will take us directly into prisons. And I actually think we should try to get all that land that the prisons are on and restore that land, to protected areas of nature as we figure out how to get people out. And then the third will sound a bit abstract, but it's what's guiding me. It's that resistance is always coupled with love. And when I'm talking about love, I mean agape is political will, not, what you have for your kids or your parents or your partner, which is important too. But this love is not interpersonal. It is communal. And in some ways, it becomes, for me, the core of spirituality, that you love people you don't like. And so we recognize the vulnerability of life, even as we protect it, and we have to defend ourselves, right, from aggressors, however that gets configured. But those would be the three: the common language using the Genocide Convention, that land we always discuss, it belongs to indigenous, but the labor belongs to all who were enslaved and exploited including the indigenous, definitely Africans. And that resistance without love, that's not going to be tenable. Nobody, you know, because then you end up looking a lot like the people I grew up with. They become really good at what they do, but why they're doing it, you know, becomes like a distant idea of some kind of noble cause.
Yeah. Such an important point, really, to, unfortunately, on my part at least, to end this wonderful conversation. And thank you so much, organizers. Thank you so much, participants. Thank you so much, attendees. And I very much hope to continue this conversation and build the language that Joy at the end, you know, suggested that we build, and take this conversation from there another time, hopefully. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, Jamil, again, for wonderful translation.
Berivan, thank you so much for catching that. Thank you so much, Jamila. Thank you. Really appreciate it.